First, there's a reminder of that story about the merchant who fell in love with the storekeeper's wife, and in order for them to elope together, they plotted the demise of this storekeeper. So after his death, they went on their way. But after some time, the merchant found that the woman was a self-serving shrew, so he dumped her. And of course, by now he was a fugitive, traveling all over the lands, not being able to remain in a place for very long. But in his travels, he saw the struggles of life and the suffering of people, and it brought about a great change in him, so that he became very repentant. And in order to enact his repentance, he decided that he would do good works. But he had a choice. He noticed that there was need for a bridge across a raging river that separated two villages. And then he thought that in one place where people were not following their faith, that if he built a temple, that it would draw people together and draw them back to realization of what life was about. And then he saw that many people died trying to ply their trade, having to cross a very precipitous mountain. Many people had fallen to their deaths trying to take this narrow path to make a living. So he decided that he would dig a tunnel through the mountain to allow people to pass safely. So he began to dig, and he dug and dug for some years. But in the meanwhile, the son of the storekeeper had grown to manhood and sworn to find his father's slayer and wreak revenge. So eventually the young man found the merchant. But when he confronted him with his sword, ready to kill him, the merchant said, "Please, please, I'm willing to die, but wait until I finish my task." So the young man reluctantly agreed. And day after day he sat on the roadside and watched the merchant digging the tunnel, until after some time he became very bored and tired with watching him complete this task. So he himself took up a shovel and joined the merchant in his digging. After some years, the task was complete. The tunnel was made. People could move freely without danger to make a living. The merchant turned to the young man, now not so young, himself with greying hairs in his head, and he said, "Now I'm ready. Take your sword and wreak your revenge." But tears began to flow out of the young man's eyes, and he fell down on his knees in front of the old merchant and said, "How can I slay you, my teacher?" And then there's the story of a young girl by the name of Hannah. Now, in Hannah's village there was another young girl older than Hannah who was nasty and cruel and vindictive, and Hannah was very afraid of her. She lived in fear every day of going out and encountering this nasty being. And she never spoke about it to anyone. So the fear and the anxiety grew inside of her. One day, she was coming out of the corner store when she heard two women talking, and one was relating to the other that she had had a very severe altercation with her neighbor, and she had gone to an old wise woman by the name of Yelda, who lived in the outskirts of the village. And this Yelda had performed some magic that resolved the whole situation. So Hannah decided that perhaps if she consulted this old woman, she too would be able to do some magic for her. So she went to Yelda and explained her situation and asked her, "Can you perform some magic?" And the old woman said, "Oh yes, I can help you with this problem." She said, "Go and bring me 3 hairs from the fiercest dog in town." And so Hannah said, "Will you work your magic for me then?" And Yelda remained silent. But Hannah went off, and she did know of a very, very fierce beast that was kept in an enclosure somewhere close to her own home, and she went, and there was the dog on a long lead, and it indeed was very fierce, because as soon as she approached it came to the length of its lead, and it barked and snarled. But very fortunately Hannah was able to find a hair just beyond the reach of the dog. So she picked it and went off home. And the next day she went, and the dog was asleep. So she was able to approach very, very carefully and find a hair that was just beyond the place where the lead ended. But just as she picked up the hair, the dog woke up and again snarled and went to the end of its lead, barking at her, and she made a very hasty retreat. But then, the next day, when she approached, the dog was inaccessible, and there was no hairs to be found. So she had a thought. The next day, she bought a treat for the dog and threw it to the dog. And the day after that, and the day after that, each day she bought a treat to the dog, until finally the dog, when it saw her, started to wag its tail in anticipation of receiving the treat. And after a little while, she was able to have the dog eating the treat out of her hand. And then, after another several days, she was able to fondle it and pet it, and very easily remove the 3rd hair from the dog. So with her 3 hairs, she hastily went to Yelda, and she said to Yelda, Here are the 3 hairs hares. Now please, will you do your magic on this girl? Yelda said, I don't do magic. And of course Hannah was very surprised and disappointed, but Yelda looked at her and said, because it's already done. It was not the girl who had to change, but you who had to change. And from that day on, Hannah walked fiercely, freely out of her house, unafraid, fearless, brave. What's the similarity and or the difference between these two stories? Because when we put them together, we have those three levels of awareness, the levels of existence. They bring together examples of these three levels of life. But in putting them together, what's the awareness that arises from them? We can recognize the seeming morals or lessons in the story. But what is it that arises for us as an understanding of their deep essence from our own experience? Where are we now? What about that little story of the farmer who loses his shovel? And that evening his neighbor passes by, gives him a friendly wave. But the farmer looks at his neighbor and says, I bet it was him. Look how he's skulking along. Look at the shifty look in his eye. He's poor. No doubt he's stolen my shovel. Then a couple of days later, the farmer's down inspecting the ditch that he had dug not so long ago to have water run to his field. And there was his shovel. And that night, when his neighbor passes, he looks just like an ordinary man. But when his neighbor waves at him, shamefacedly, the farmer turns away, ashamed of the thought that he had in perceiving his neighbor. Where are we when we're no longer bound by the perceptions that arise from any of the three levels of existence? The nitty-gritty, cause and effect, the dreams, aspirations, hopes that arise from the spiritual level, and even the oneness, love, compassion, pity, empathy that are present in the third level. Where are your perceptions now?
Well, we certainly haven't got expectations, and it's like then we step through the doorway of that fear, so we're not, so that, or nothing, that's the biggest thing that holds people,
Yes.
I reckon, is fear.
That's right.
So then once we're through that, it's where that next thing.
Yes.
You know, for me, the answer to your question is freedom.
Right.
And it reminds me of my calendar. Your stories remind me of my calendar. I've been looking at it. It's the Buddha calendar, and the Buddha said your work is to find your work and then to keep it all in your heart.
That's right.
And that's what those two people did, isn't it?
They did, absolutely. And it's exactly what Wendy was talking about, isn't it?
Through that, yeah.
Through tribulation, through losses, through
Yeah. And then the beauty of him just following what was in front of him every day, because there was nothing left to do.
yes.
Following that line still.
But what is our challenge now when we recognize that this has got nothing to do with those emotional states of compassion and pity and calling, or it's not there, is it? In everything that we do, we're not thinking, oh, I'm doing this for God, or I'm doing this because I'm going to get brownie points in heaven. There's none of that at all, is there? So it's a relation with our perceptions, and in that question, what is your relationship with life now? We find the answer to it, isn't it? Because now we recognize it's not to do with perceptions. Not to do with perceptions. Because that is being spoken of now doesn't have any names or forms or colour or emotion related to it. It doesn't. All right, we give it the general name of a spiritual path, but that has no connotation for us. The spirituality has lost its meaning for us. So what is it? Where are we? What is it that lies beyond those three levels of perception, or three levels of mind, or three dimensions of existence? What is it that embraces them all, contains them all? Not mind. Thank you, thank you.